Herzlich willkommen. Welcome everybody to our today's Café, the monthly colloquium featuring cutting-edge Anabaptist scholarship. Thanks for joining us. There's a relatively small number of people currently in the meeting, but we had more registration, so I assume more people will be dropping in the next few minutes. Just to briefly say something about me, my name is Martin Lutz. I'm a social and economic historian at Humboldt University in Berlin. Berlin, the one in Germany, not one of the ones in Ohio and other places in North America. I very much hope that the transatlantic connection will be stable in the next hour or so. If I'm cutting out, if you cannot understand me very well, please give me a sign, and then hopefully I can do something about it. I would like to briefly also acknowledge the person behind the scenes who is making all of this possible, who is Andrea Waxmansky, who is she's setting up all the technology behind it. She organizes these events and makes it possible in that way. Thank you so much, Andrea, for all that you do for the association and for the scholarship committee that is hosting this event. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, I ask you that you save your questions to the end of the presentation or put them in the chat. Our presenter will talk for about 20 minutes to 30 minutes or so, and that should allow us plenty of time for discussion and questions afterwards. For those of you who do join in our discussion after the presentation, your questions and comments will be recorded, and those recordings will be available to our members only on our newly designed website, so it will not be publicly accessible. And with these organizational things, I will now come to the introduction of today's speaker, Ian Kleinsasser, and the book that he wrote, Blessings and Burdens, 100 Years of Hutterites in Manitoba. Ian is a historian, researcher based at Crystal Spring Hutterite community in southern Manitoba. He holds a bachelor's degree in education from Brandon University in Manitoba, and he's, I think, within the Hutterite world, he's a very prominent figure in the historical debates. Let's put it that. He also serves as the Hutterite German teacher, and he's, if I remember correctly, very much involved with these teachers' conferences or Lehrerkonferenzen of Hutterites in Canada. The book that he's going to talk about was published in 2019 by the Hutterian Brethren Book Center in, I think, McGregor in Manitoba. And the book is a result of 3 lectures that Ian gave in 2019 as part of the Jacob Maendel lecture series, a lecture series that was established in the honor of Jacob Maendel, a very prominent Hutterite in the post-World War II era, who was very much engaged in promoting the educational effort among Hutterites. The book that Ian wrote addresses came out of the Hutterite Centennial in Manitoba, and it offers an insider's perspective, an emic perspective from within the Hutterite community, saying that it is based on academic standards of empirical research. So for historians, the gold standard is empirical work, working with primary sources, and that's very much at the core of this book. And it thus offers a very interesting perspective on Hutterite history, and at the same time, a very important contribution to the academic debate on not just Hutterite history, but in a broader sense, various aspects of ethnicity and nation building, the economic history of joint property, and various other aspects. I'm biased towards the book, I have to say, because I reviewed it and quite liked it, but others reviewed it as well. Just today, I saw that a historian, fairly prominent historian, also wrote a review of the book, Stephen Nold, a historian at the Young Center of Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. Stephen Nold is a scholar who is primarily interested in Amish and Mennonite history, but he wrote a review of Ian's book. I actually don't know if you saw that review. I can pass it on to you in the journal Church History. And just a couple of short quotes from this review. It's a remarkable volume, quote unquote, and it's a very important contribution. And I very much agree. And with this brief introduction, I would like to thank you again for joining us today, Ian Kleinsasser, and speaking with us about your book, Blessings and Burden. And I will pass on to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Martin. I would like to just add one slight correction. I am actually the English school teacher, but I am involved at the education conference planning. But yeah, so yeah, our community, we have about five of our own members that are teaching in our school, and we're sort of I sort of touch on that in the lecture, that sort of the way our education system is sort of split into two. And a lot of Hutterites tend to view education along that split, the German and English split. And I think that's somewhat of an unfortunate split. But I'll talk about that maybe later. I'll share my screen here. Let me know if this is up. Okay. Good, perfect. So blessings and burdens. I guess talking about just the title a little bit, that was something we talked about. The title actually came out of, I guess, like many books. Initially, we had different titles, and we were working through it. And a couple of the other Hutterite members who I was working with, Jesse Hofer from Silver Winds and Kenny Wallman from Baker, were also historians. As we were working with sort of the text and especially in the context of the Centennial Lecture, the term blessings and burdens sort of jumped out at us from one of the texts that we were working with. And it just felt like, you know, this is a perfect title, right? It really talks about the blessings of history, of doing this type of work, but also the burden that comes with it, right? That telling the story, telling it right? And you know, at the end of the day, everybody wants their story told the way they, you know, the way that they think is correct, right? And so that was, I think, something, a huge struggle for us is you know, even by penning these lectures, are we telling the story right? Or is this just our version, our story? And that was something that was very much in the back of our thinking. And I'll get back to that at the end of the lecture, or the end of the talk, where I'll touch on sort of that aspect of it. So first, I want to just talk a little bit of an introduction to my family. This is a picture of my family, 3 girls and 4 boys. Our latest addition was a 4-month-old little boy. So that keeps things busy at home. So a big challenge. It's a big challenge, I think, with trying to do history and also doing family, right? And doing them both well. And sometimes the last couple of years I've learned that you know I have to put my family first. You know, the history, the documents aren't necessarily going to run away. They'll be still sitting there. But the kids, they grow up and they do tend to leave. So it's important to keep that perspective as well. So in the lecture, I'm going to focus on 4 lenses. So first, the outward lens is the one where we looked at how the Hutterites have interacted with the world. And I put world in sort of scare quotes because that is sort of a catchphrase. Hutterites often tend to use the world as die Welt. Anything that is outside of their community will be considered world. And I think that's sort of been a tension with that, because I know a lot of our ministers will often say, well, no, that's a wrong understanding of what world is, right? World can also be in our community. It's you know, you know, the Welt kann auch in dir sein. The world can be within you, right? You can be a worldly person living inside a community, right? And let's not just world everything. Let's paint everything on the outside with a paintbrush, right? And I think there was definitely a temptation to do that. And the other one is next second focus is where we sort of look at the interconference conflicts that develop here, and they really start developing right from the beginning. As a matter of fact, I've made the argument that when the Hutterites came to North America, they brought conflicts with them, and our chronicle is largely silent on that. But it's there, right? The evidence, it's self-evident. The fact that they came in 3 groups already hints at conflict, right? And it didn't take long for those conflicts to emerge. And then the other one, another, I guess, major aspect, I think, is the Hutterite and the Bruderhof relationship. How over time, since the 1920s, we've tended to ebb and flow between states of unity and disunity, as the 2 groups are attracted to each other, and then we're both developing, in a sense, we both develop our own identities, and so that then creates disunity. And so we've broken apart, we've come back together again, and so it's sort of this interesting dynamic relationship that has, I think, reshaped both groups in profound ways. Then the other major topic that I deal with is the Hutterites versus the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, in a sense, right? Dealing with looking at questions of how Hutterites have dealt with education, with economics, how we've interacted with government, politics. All of these things have had profound impacts on shaping our communities, especially here, I think, here in North America, as we've adapted to the North American landscape. We've been, in a sense, impacted both in America and in Canada by the different educational philosophies, by the nationalism of these countries, the militarism. All of these things have had deep impacts, and it hasn't impacted our communities the same. So the communities in the U.S. have faced unique challenges that have not been experienced in the Canadian communities, and then maybe vice versa. So and in the book, I sort of tried, or in the lecture, I tried to talk about some of those things. So I want to just a quick overview of Jacob D Maendel. Jacob D Maendel is my maternal grandfather. He was a teacher, he was a pastor, community leader, but I think was mostly known for his promotion of education. And that came around about, I think, largely because of the need that he saw, and that need was sort of driven, in a sense, by factors outside our community. So in the 1930s, Depression years, poverty, World War II, a lot of people leaving to fight in the war. There was a shortage of teachers on the home front, and so often Hutterite schools would be grouped together with local schools, and teachers were not trained. They were often very young, 18-year-old young people who would get what's called a permit license, which would be a temporary license. You didn't have to have any teaching degree or training of any kind. You just applied for a permit license. You were granted the license, and you could teach for a year. And they usually lasted a month or 2 if they were good. And then they'd quit, and then you'd have another teacher, and then some of them would last, according to my aunts, for about a week, because they'd be thrown into a classroom with 40, 50 kids of all age groups. And so this was sort of in my grandfather's community was the norm in the 30s and 40s. And so that was increasingly frustrating because he noticed that the children were lacking in the education. And so that was for him, became a big driving factor, was we need to retake the responsibility of educating our children. And I talk about that in the book, in the lecture. I talk about how that came to be, that the Hutterites had abandoned that, where we sort of, in a sense, lost control of the education of our children. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. So he was I think, a visionary person, and very well connected, even within the Mennonite scholarly world. So recently discovered that he was on intimate conversation levels with C.F. Klassen and Harold S. Bender and Robert Friedemann. they would meet periodically in Winnipeg, and they'd have these discussions and things like that. And I think those discussions, they matter, right? Because there was, I think, a transfer of ideas and vision. So now, if I look at, just start from the first lecture, one of the things I looked at the Hutterites and the world. So the first, I think, where the book sort of takes off is it started with the question of how did we get here, right? Here meaning Canada. And so I of course went back and I looked at sort of what happened in the US, because initially when the Hutterites came, we settled in South Dakota. And then by 1918, most of the Hutterites were in Canada. And so, of course, I'm not going to go into the details, but toward the end of the war, anti-German sentiment was increasing in South Dakota. People were more and more upset with conscientious objectors. And the colonies were being drafted. Young men were being sent to the camps where they were refusing to work. There were, I think some of the stories are fairly well known about how they were mistreated, and some of them even died in the camps. And then, but I think what sort of where the first two were I think common factors that all the COs were experiencing. The Mennonite COs were experiencing that as well, but where it sort of started connecting or hitting deeper for the Hutterites was when the abuse started targeting their colonies. So people would sneak in at night and they'd dump glass into their flour mills, and because they were producing commercial flour to sell, and so these I think attacks more than anything really impressed on the Hutterites the notion that it's time to move on. We're not wanted here. Right. And so they started looking for different places. But I think the final straw was sort of what I termed the constitutional attack, where the state of South Dakota basically declared the Hutterite communal system illegal and ordered the court, and through the courts were able to order the system dissolved. And so it made it impossible for them to pool their resources, to pool their money. And so that was, I think, sort of the final straw. And so the Hutterites, after that, decided it's time to leave. And so from there, the Hutterites, of course, went to two provinces, Alberta, primarily Alberta and Manitoba. So they where they then started establishing themselves. Initially, I think they had all intended to go to Alberta, but my branch, the Schmiedeleut, never liked Alberta, and so we ended up in Manitoba. That was, again, cause for quite a bit of conflict later. Because the other groups felt that our group were pulling away from them, in a sense, was the accusation, by settling hundreds of miles apart. In Manitoba, I think we see a really good example of what I call community in action. The Schmiedeleut realized, or the Hutterites realized, that any big move like that is going to have huge financial implications, and they realized that they could not accomplish this on their own, and so they pooled all their resources, their financial resources, and purchased all the land in one lump sum, and so that enabled them to move up fairly rapidly and reestablish. And in a sense, they came up way too fast, because the fact that they were buying thousands of acres, spending almost $1 million in 1918, really triggered a lot of resentment from a lot of the local people, who felt that here's these rich German pacifists who've gotten rich, staying at home, not fighting, are coming in and they're buying up all the farmland. And they didn't realize the true economic picture. The fact that the Hutterites borrowed most of that money to actually facilitate, and it took them almost till the 1970s to pay off that debt. So a significant thing, but I guess from outside looking in, a lot of people didn't see that. And for instance, and then I threw in here the Articles of Association, which was something that as the colonies were establishing themselves in Manitoba, they started running into financial difficulties. And so they realized that if all the colonies are seen as one financial entity, if one colony runs into financial difficulty, that exposes all the other colonies on a financial. And so they started incorporating each colony as a separate entity, and it began So it was done as a protective measure, but it also has sort of ramifications, whereas up till now, all the colonies saw themselves as a unit. They saw themselves as a communal organization. And now, because they're splitting off, by the simple act of splitting off each colony as an individual entity, we see, I would say, what I call communal individualism setting in. As the communities start seeing themselves as individual communities and even getting into conflict with the church, right? And that causes sort of conflict to develop. Next part I touch about is sort of the early, when the Hutterites initially established their communities in Moravia, very early on, they saw the importance of a well-rounded education. And so there was very special attention paid to educating children, and especially having control of that education. But when they came to North America, that changed quite dramatically. In the early years in South Dakota, they had full control of their own schools still. They had Hutterites teaching in Hutterite schools, but as South Dakota began to develop, they begin to demand that the colony start connecting to or start abiding by the curriculum, following the curriculum, right? And of course, the Hutterite educators, most of them spoke German. They didn't speak English, so they couldn't teach English. So they had to start hiring outside teachers. And when they came to Manitoba, that completely changed. Manitoba refused to accept anybody who couldn't speak what they termed the Queen's English. And so all the Hutterite teachers, who even though they had certificates for teaching, were not allowed to teach. And so literally in one generation, we went from Hutterites teaching in schools to no Hutterite teachers in school and just outside Hutterite teachers. And I think that sort of kicks in, so the vehicle of acculturation and assimilation start sort of working. And it's very clear to see that was the intent fairly early on here in Manitoba. The teachers saw their role as assimilating the Hutterites into mainstream society. So that was I think, a major development. So the other factor, now somebody's gonna have to keep watch of the time here. I'm just gonna be rambling on here, but hopefully give me a sign if I'm getting near the end of the time, and then we'll just sort of stop there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Hutterite Bruderhof relationship. What's I think remarkable about the two stories is that both communities emerge, what I call they're forged by fire. They're both emerge out of social disruption, right? The Hutterites come out of the social disruption of the peasant wars and the Reformation. Sort of this new, and I connect it somewhat to the emergence of capitalism, right? You see that and how that's changing societies in Europe. And I think you could make the argument that Hutterites were in a sense saying no to that new form of capitalism and trying to hang on to the older form of the communal, pasture, communal ownerships. And so that in some way, I think you can interpret the Hutterite movement from that perspective. But then in the Bruderhof context, you have a very similar scenario. They emerge out of the turmoil of World War I and World War II. So massive social upheaval, the old, the center doesn't hold anymore. Was it Virgil who said that? All of Europe is in turmoil. And then out of this comes the Bruderhof, right? Trying to live out community of goods, right? And then eventually the two communities meet in roughly about 1920s. They become aware of each other. Eberhard Arnold, who is their leader, visits the Hutterites, spends an entire year visiting the colonies here in Canada and North America. And we're actually right in the process of moving from Canada or America to Canada. And so at the end of the visit, we end up, there was a uniting, I call it a unity from afar. The Hutterites basically accepted the Bruderhof as members of their community, but had never visited their communities yet. And that visit wasn't about to happen till 1937, I believe, just before World War I or World War II breaks out. Matter of fact, there's a fascinating story about the two Hutterites who were there at the time and probably ended what the Gestapo was planning to do to the Bruderhof. you know, if they hadn't been there. So then the next chapter, one of the themes I look at is a word, a term I think, like the world only later in time, which is I lifted that quote out of a book from, or a paper from Marcus Bach. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Marcus Bach. He's considered one of the fathers of, what would we call it? Not Unitarianism, but he sort of studied, I guess, comparative religion, maybe. Anyway, so he was fascinated by different religions in the world and spent quite a bit of time traveling among the Hutterite colonies, or traveling between Hutterite colonies, and was very fascinated. And so he wrote quite a couple of papers about them. And in there, he uses the term, it's a Hutterite who makes the statement. He says, we are like the world only later in time, meaning that we are slowly being acculturated just, 50 years later, right? So that's sort of what the term means there. So, and I think we see that process starting sort of in the Depression years and then really accelerating, I think, after World War II. So the Great Depression had its impacts. During this time, we see sort of this incorporation that I mentioned earlier, where the colonies are incorporating themselves as individual entities. And I think that subtly changes the face of community. We see that emerge as we change. Our leadership structure undergoes a major change. Up to that point, our conference had only the leadership structure in our conference was set up. We had a committee of trustees that governed the overall, or I guess had control of the overall governance of the community or communities. And I believe the Hutterites copied that from the Amana colonies in Iowa and maybe the Harmonists in Pennsylvania. Both groups had major impact on the Hutterites when we came here to North America. And both of those communities were set up in that similar, they were run by trustees, not by an eldership model. And in the 1930s, we see the Hutterites drop that system and go back to an eldership structure. And it's largely related to the fact that they had increasing conflict between community leaders. And the community leaders when other community leaders would step in to try to resolve the issues, the response was, what gives you the right to intervene in our community? Yeah, I'm an ordained minister just like you guys are. You have no say here, right? And so there was this sort of, I guess they came to a stalemate. Well, we have to come up with a solution. And so they basically came up with the eldership solution, where all the leaders, basically, when an elder is chosen, agree that they will accept this elder's oversight. So they authorize him to deal with let's say in cases where there's a conflict within communities, especially if it involves the leadership of that community, the elder is authorized to step in and act as a mediator, right? And that is sort of clearly spelled out that it's supposed to be his role. But I think that has also shifted. So World War II, this is where, here in Manitoba, the Hutterites largely were dealt with, or were assigned to alternative service. They didn't have to show up in the war camps or in the training camps. So I think that was sort of a major difference from the U.S. experience. And in the book, I mostly cover or look at the Manitoba response, or how the alternative service affected the Canadian Hutterites and not the Americans. That was, again, a very different experience. And I call it the collision of two worlds, because for the very first time, you had a lot of young Hutterite men, 18-year-old, pushed out of the forest to leave their communities. And many of them lived outside of their communities for, 4 or 5 years in these alternative service camps. Some of them were assigned, by the end of the war, most of them were actually in what is called Thunder Bay today, which is sort of a big city on one of the big lakes, where they were shoveling grain or unloading grain train cars, and filling supply ships. And so they were exposed to a lot of the, what I call I guess the other side, the world, in a sense, right? They you know, and you sort of see that in a lot of the letters that are being written between the young men and their parents and the pastors, and the fact that the church then started sending pastors to live in the camps with the young men, and they're starting to deal with issues of dress and other worldly ideas that these young men are being exposed to. And I think it would be a fascinating paper to do, would be to look at the influence that a lot of these young men brought as they came back into the communities after the war. Many of these influences come back with them, right? And we see the communities really changing a lot during that time period. And I found this one interesting card. It was just a note in a CO camp in a book. This is like one of these friendship books where people write in, and this young man had written in there, "Die Welt ist nicht ein Hühnerstall, es sind schöne Mädchen überall." The world is not a chicken coop. There's beautiful girls all over the place, right? And so you could say, in a sense, his eyes are open, right? There's beauty around, right? There's other beautiful people around him, and so I think that is a shift that I think we as communities, when we look back at our history, we have to sort of struggle or try to understand, what impact that did that have, and I think it did have a significant one.
So sorry to briefly step in, Ian. This is a very interesting point, and I think that's also very relevant for Mennonite communities. Given the time frame, maybe do you think you could wrap up within the next 8 to 10 minutes or so?
Yep.
Great,
yeah,
thank you.
Okay, so the Great Depression again had, I think, a bigger economic impact on the colonies than, I guess, in one way of putting it, the Great Depression were, in a sense, they were good, and they had their good and their bad, right? It forced the colonies to work more closely together, but it also, because, well, I'll put it this way. During the Depression years, the Hutterites were known for being one of the only farmers who could pay their taxes, right? So that had a significant impact on how the political leaders viewed the Hutterites. But it also then, for the non-political members, the other farmers who saw this, it starts creating resentment against the Hutterites. So on one side of the political aspect, the politicians see the colonies as beneficial, whereas the farmers and their neighbors see them as a problem. So that, I think, I'll just leave it at that. That, I think, plays out then in what we see here in Manitoba and Alberta as increasing, so what I call increasing wealth. The colonies are starting to become more prosperous, but and then also leads to increasing discrimination. In Alberta, we get land restriction legislation passed, forbidding Hutterites from expanding or trying to limit them. And in Manitoba, we have something called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was basically the Hutterites attempting to stop the province from actually passing legislation. They agreed to self-monitor. They would implement the recommendations themselves. And so they did that for a number of years till it eventually they got thrown out by the government, and I can talk about that maybe later. And at that time, this is where Marcus Bach, I think, comes in. He was brought in by the government, actually, as a friend of the Hutterites, but as a scholar, especially who studied communal groups, as an expert to testify for the government at the legislature in Winnipeg. And he made a couple of interesting recommendations. He said, if you want the Hutterites to assimilate, and he says, and don't get me wrong, he said, they already are assimilated. And he said that, regretfully. He said, the Hutterites are my friends, and I've been trying to tell them that you guys are assimilating, you're acculturating, and they're not listening, right? It's through the economics and all of these things that you are being pulled into society and that it's changing your communities. And the Hutterites denied it. They said, no, that's not happening. Will never happen. And he said, it is happening. And so his recommendation to the legislation in the end was, well, if you want them to assimilate, one of the things, improved school curriculum. right? Take control of the education, make them part of the public education system. That will eventually make them, turn them into Canadians. He said tolerance and understanding. Be tolerant towards them, be understanding, because if you persecute them, you're only going to make them strong. So do the opposite. Treat them nicely. And then get them to participate in politics. If they start being, I mean, I guess we've seen that the last couple of years here in North America, how being involved in politics, it gets pretty messy, right? And it pulls people in. And so that was his thing, get them involved somehow. And then the other one was, he said, just reject the land restrictions. I think that's sort of a play on the second one, be tolerant and understanding. Don't restrict them. Let them alone. They will eventually. And he says, I think there's been over 100 different communal groups in North America, and the Hutterites are the last one. They're going to go eventually. And so eventually that, it sort of backfired, because they did in 1950, at the end of that, all the Hutterites got together and created one constitution. And it was, they created what we call the 1950s Constitution, with its entire purpose was to fend off attacks from outside the community. And so to get all three groups working together to fight off any external attacks. And so that worked. It worked really well for the Hutterites till they ran out of external enemies. So once they'd fought all the battles, they then turned inward, and the same constitution then becomes a tool of disunity, where they then, and that sort of comes to the modern era, and where that the same, you could say, I use the term seeds of disunity. So the Constitution, and initially was a good thing for fighting off persecution from without, and then once that is gone, we start persecuting each other, and we get sort of what, with the internal battles, the internal wars. The 1992 was a really bad year here in Manitoba, where our conference split into two. And then in 1994, we had the parting of ways with the Bruderhof communities. And a lot of those, we can see the seeds of these, I think, disunities can go back to the 1950s Constitution and sort of its purpose and how that changed, and sort of the developments from there on. So I believe that's sort of, I'll wrap it up with that.